They laughed at her like she was a joke, mocked her skin, her clothes, her quiet voice, then told her to leave before she made the place look cheap. In a lobby built for wealth and whiteness, she was treated like dirt in designer shoes, dragged down by stares that sliced deeper than words. They called her visits mistakes, her questions ridiculous, her presence disruptive. Not one person stood up. Not one voice said her name. She was just another black woman told she didn't belong, not by accident, but by design. Day after day, she returned. Each time, they pushed harder, sneered louder, and tested how far humiliation could go before it broke a soul. But what they didn't realize was that she was never the one breaking. She was watching, calculating, turning their cruelty into a slow, silent trap. And when it snapped shut, it wasn't anger that crushed them, it was truth. If that opening hit you like it should, hit like and subscribe. Stick around as we walk you through the lies, the silence, and the final twist that made them regret every word. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Because this story, it's about more than her. It's about all of us. The rotating glass doors of Halstead Private Trust spun with a slow, almost ceremonial rhythm as Clarice Whitmore stepped into the lobby. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and lacquered wood. Every detail in the room, from the sharp lines of the leather seating to the discreet gleam of brass fixtures, screamed wealth and exclusivity. Clarice walked forward with quiet determination. Her beige tailored suit was pressed to perfection. Her low-heeled shoes tapped gently against the polished marble floor, each step measured and deliberate. Her tightly coiled hair was shaped neatly above her shoulders, and she carried a single leather folio clutched in both hands. She was not here to ask for permission, nor to prove her worth. She had come prepared. As she approached the curved reception desk, the young woman seated behind it looked up and froze for a moment. The receptionist, no older than 23, with pale skin and carefully curled bangs, fumbled with her computer mouse as Clarice greeted her and explained that she had a 9 a.m. appointment with a portfolio officer. Her voice was even, her tone warm but professional. The receptionist's eyes flickered down to her monitor, her fingers typing faster than necessary. Clarice stood waiting, hands folded neatly. She had arrived 10 minutes early. The receptionist didn't invite her to sit, didn't ask if she'd like coffee or water, just mumbled that she'd check and turned back to her screen without another word. Clarice remained standing for 21 minutes. Other clients came and went. A pair of elderly men chatted in hushed tones over the business section of the Tribune. A young couple pushed a stroller past her and whispered to each other. Clarice stayed quiet, her chin lifted, her spine unyielding. She had learned years ago not to let long silences or lingering stares shift her focus. At 9:27, a side door opened with a thud. Out strode Arthur Bellamy. His presence hit the lobby like a shove. He was tall, thick through the shoulders, with slicked back, graying hair and a gold tie clip shaped like an eagle. His sleeves were rolled just above his elbows in a manner that suggested he considered himself both elite and hands-on. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Clarice like a weight. Without asking her name, without even a pretense of curiosity, he barked out that no one should be standing around without clearance. The receptionist said nothing. She stared fixedly at her screen. Bellamy walked straight to Clarice and demanded to know who she was and why she was loitering in his lobby. Clarice calmly repeated that she had an appointment and began to open her folio. He cut her off with a wave of his hand, barking that Halstead wasn't the sort of place that offered walk-in services for random people with binders full of dreams. His voice carried across the room. A man in a tailored blazer stopped sipping his espresso. A woman with a designer handbag lowered her sunglasses. Clarice maintained her poise. She clarified again that she was here for a scheduled meeting regarding a portfolio transfer, that she had received confirmation the previous week. Bellamy stared at her shoes, then back at her face. His lip curled. He asked loudly if she had gotten lost on her way to the employment office 2 blocks down. Someone laughed. The receptionist turned away. Bellamy moved a step closer and told her Halstead had a reputation for filtering out misfits. He said her kind always thought dressing up in suits meant they belonged. Clarice didn't blink. She extended a printed copy of her appointment confirmation. Bellamy didn't take it. He smirked and said anyone could whip up something like that at a public library printer. Then, in a final display of disdain, he turned to the security guard standing off to the side and asked him if the bank had recently started letting just anyone in off the street. The guard grinned, arms folded. He said he was wondering the same thing. Bellamy, still speaking loudly, said perhaps someone should sanitize the lobby rug. Clarice hadn't moved. Her eyes were steady, her jaw locked in a perfect line. She said nothing. She let him fill the silence with his own ugliness. The receptionist turned and asked if she should call the janitorial crew for a floor sweep. Bellamy nodded, then addressed Clarice one final time. He said she had 30 seconds to take her appointment fantasy and walk out before they made a formal call to have her escorted out. Clarice remained still. He stepped forward, leaning in as if about to shout. She finally spoke again, softly, and said that she would leave now. Her voice was steady, every syllable carefully chosen. She turned without further words, walked to the doors, and stepped into the morning air. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm. Clarice walked 2 blocks without speaking. She did not rush. She did not weep. Her hands remained steady, her face calm. But inside, the ache was growing. Not because of what Bellamy had said, she had heard worse from men with less, but because of the eyes that had turned away, the ones who had heard, who had watched, and who had done nothing. She had entered that building to move capital, to explore long-term financial strategy, to do serious business. Instead, she had been framed as an intruder, a stain on their pristine floor. The city was just waking up around her as she approached the glossy entrance, its polished stone facade as unbending and cold as it had been the day before, yet she didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. Her hands clutched a new leather folder containing the same printed confirmation, this time backed with time-stamped emails, screenshots, and calendar details. Nothing that could be dismissed as faked or imagined. She had replayed the previous day in her head all night, the moment Bellamy tore her dignity apart piece by piece under artificial light. His voice turned up just loud enough to make her feel like an exhibit on a floor reserved for the elite, and yet her feet carried her forward because Clarice was not raised to turn away when she was right. Inside the lobby, everything remained as pristine and indifferent as it had been, and the same receptionist behind the curved desk looked up just long enough to recognize her, before looking away just as fast. Clarice approached and greeted her again, voice calm, shoulders aligned, tone even. She stated once more her name, the purpose of her visit, and that she had a confirmed appointment. Before the receptionist could respond, Arthur Bellamy's voice sliced across the room from the corridor, already colored with mockery before she even finished her sentence. He strode in, sleeves rolled again, neck flushed, eyes sharp, his voice louder than necessary as he announced to everyone within earshot that it looked like someone was lost again. Clients waiting in high-backed leather chairs glanced up from their phones and tablets as he pointed toward the glass doors she had just walked through and declared that this building was frequently mistaken for the job placement office 2 blocks away. Clarice didn't respond. She stood firm, expression unreadable, body completely still except for the subtle movement of her hand extending the document. Bellamy didn't even look at it at first. Instead, he motioned across the lobby to a janitor hauling a yellow mop bucket across the marble floor and said, with a smirk so visible it felt like a slap, that Clarice might find she had more in common with him than with any portfolio officer in the building. The room went quiet for a moment before a few awkward chuckles spilled from the corners, and Bellamy finally stepped forward and snatched the printed page from her hand. He held it up, looked at it with exaggerated scrutiny. Then, without even scanning the first line, ripped it clean down the center, then again across the middle, letting the pieces drift down like dead leaves to the polished floor at her feet. Clarice looked down at the scraps, her face still, her breath even, and slowly crouched to pick up each piece, tucking them quietly back into her folder, without a word. As she did, an elderly man in a navy suit sitting nearby leaned slightly toward the woman next to him and let out a chuckle, a dry, rasping sound. as if the scene amused him more than any business headline that morning. Clarice stood, straightened her coat, and glanced toward the front desk again. Bellamy crossed his arms with a satisfied huff and turned to the receptionist, telling her flatly that she should request someone bring up air freshener, because he said loudly enough for it to land like an insult rather than a joke. The room suddenly had a very different kind of scent. The receptionist froze, unsure of how to respond, but said nothing. Clarice made no sound, no protest, no plea. She simply stood there, poised and quiet, looking directly at the receptionist, not to shame her, not to pressure her, but simply to be seen. But the receptionist, like the others before her, broke eye contact and turned back to her screen. Clarice lowered her folder into her handbag and asked politely if the calendar had room for her meeting, to which the receptionist replied that unfortunately the schedule had filled up for the morning and no alternative time could be given. Bellamy, pretending to be finished with the encounter, muttered to himself and disappeared behind the security doors with a shake of his head. Clarice waited for 10 more minutes by the entryway, scanning the same cold furnishings, the same muted tones of oil paintings and plant arrangements that lined the lobby like a museum of exclusion. A few clients came and went, some offering a second glance, none offering a word. At 9:38, she walked out again, her steps no faster than before, her face unreadable. On the sidewalk, she paused near the edge of the building where the sun barely reached, and for a long moment she remained there, eyes forward, breath steady, as the rush of morning traffic moved behind her. She adjusted the strap on her handbag, whispered something to herself that only she could hear, and walked eastward into the day. There was no vengeance in her gait, no dramatics in her pace, only the silent understanding that some battles begin by returning to the field, again and again, until the earth remembers who it tried to bury. That lobby would remember her. That receptionist would remember the pause before turning away. That maintenance man would remember her face next time someone made him the butt of a joke. And Bellamy, he would remember that no matter how loudly he tried to dismiss her, she walked back in. Her bag was smaller today, a dark leather clutch with subtle stitching, clasped tightly under her arm. She didn't bother looking at the receptionist. She already knew the young woman's eyes would drop as soon as recognition hit. Clarice walked past the waiting area and stopped exactly where she'd stopped twice before, by the Marble Island desk, where one was meant to wait for a portfolio officer to arrive. She said nothing at first. There was nothing more to prove. She had the same appointment request, the same calendar entry, the same name signed on the bottom of the confirmation. But Clarice wasn't holding any papers today. She wasn't there to show anyone a document they'd just find a way to ignore. She was there because she said she would be. And when a woman like her says she will return, the act of returning is itself the purpose. Arthur Bellamy appeared minutes later, as he always did, not summoned, but as though drawn to the scent of discomfort. His shoes tapped quickly across the tile, and as he stepped into view, he stopped and gave a short, exaggerated whistle, like a stage actor walking into a scene where the audience already knew the punchline. His grin was wide, theatrical, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. He stepped toward her, slowly this time, circling her as if inspecting a statue in a gallery he found distasteful. He clucked his tongue and commented on the color of her jacket, said it was bold for someone still pretending to have business here. Clarice didn't look at him. She kept her chin steady, her hands composed. He walked around her again and made a show of glancing at her bag, tilting his head as if trying to decide whether it came from a discount bin or a donation pile. He turned toward a young assistant standing nearby and raised his eyebrows, pretending to whisper, but making sure his voice carried. He asked if they'd started letting non-profit interns in through the front now. The assistant laughed, though his eyes darted to Clarice's face nervously. Bellamy wasn't done. He stepped in front of her and straightened his tie before asking her, loud enough for the entire room to hear, how long she was planning to play dress up. He said her shoes looked borrowed. Her earrings didn't match her energy. Then he stepped closer, eyes narrowing, and said she stood like someone who had never been taught posture, like someone who grew up leaning against stairwells instead of being taught to stand with grace. His words were slow, slicing, deliberate. A couple with a baby seated across the room watched with visible discomfort. The woman shifted in her seat, bouncing the child on her knee, as if trying to pretend she wasn't listening. But she was. Everyone was. Clarice kept her gaze level, her hand still. Bellamy reached into a drawer behind the desk and pulled out a laminated pamphlet, one clearly designed for new clients, but he held it in front of him like a shield, waving it slowly between them. He declared that Halstead's Trust Division didn't participate in experimental outreach. He said they didn't run community rehabilitation schemes or entry-level savings support. He said this was not a place for learning how to handle money. This was a place for preserving it. He asked if she understood the difference. Clarice did not move. She did not blink. She took one small step back and nodded, a single graceful motion that felt more powerful than 1,000 rebuttals. She turned and walked out again, passing the couple, the assistant, the receptionist, and the glass doors she had now walked through more times than she could count. No one stopped her. No one followed. But this time, the discomfort didn't disappear after she left. The receptionist bit her lip and stared at the screen even after Clarice had gone. The young assistant shifted his weight and quietly returned to his desk, stealing a glance toward Bellamy, who was still holding the laminated pamphlet like a child holding a toy sword. The woman with the baby whispered something to her husband. He didn't answer. He was watching the doors. Outside, Clarice didn't walk as slowly as she had the day before. Her pace was steady, her breath even, but something inside had quickened. Not rage, not tears. Something deeper. The feeling of layers being peeled back. The realization that the cruelty here wasn't just personal. It was systemic, polished, and rehearsed. Bellamy had turned her presence into theater, not because she had done anything unusual, but because the very sight of her returning unsettled the structure he thought he controlled. He needed her to shrink. And when she didn't, he became louder, crueler, more precise with his cuts. Clarice walked 3 blocks without stopping, then stood at a crosswalk for longer than necessary, her eyes fixed on the pedestrian light. The traffic passed, people moved, and the day went on, but she remained perfectly still. Every insult echoed back to her now with a kind of surgical clarity. Every observation he had made about her posture, her bag, her appearance, her presence. But more than that, the thing that stayed with her most was not the mockery itself. It was the ease with which he performed it, and the ease with which others watched. This time, no one laughed, but no one stopped it either. And that silence was no less violent. She knew now this wasn't about an appointment. It was about erasure. She wore a charcoal wool coat this time, heavier than the light jacket she had worn before, its texture subtly luxurious, its fit impeccable, tailored just as precisely as the dignity she refused to let fray. Her bag was slimmer, her gloves were folded neatly in one hand, and in the other, she carried a white envelope sealed with a small brass sticker. The paper stock was thick, textured, the kind used for formal financial correspondences, and inside were details she knew no one would read. She didn't expect respect anymore. She just wanted to document the disrespect. When she entered, she was greeted by the same receptionist, though this time the young woman looked up only briefly and with a flicker of hesitation before returning to her screen. Clarice did not pause. She walked directly to the counter and announced her purpose, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly. Before the receptionist could respond, Bellamy arrived again, as if summoned by the scent of her confidence. He approached with a swagger that felt almost rehearsed now, like an actor returning for his favorite monologue. His voice echoed off the walls before he even reached her. He gestured to her coat, commented sarcastically on the upgrade, said it looked like someone had discovered department store clearance racks. Clarice ignored it, held out the envelope calmly, and said she had documents to be delivered to the portfolio team. Bellamy snatched it from her hand without a word, held it up between 2 fingers like it might be contaminated, then turned toward the overhead lighting and tilted it back and forth. He squinted at it, then shook his head and declared, loud enough for clients in the waiting area to hear, that the envelope seemed to contain more fiber than her bank account. There was laughter from a corner near the espresso station, quiet but unmistakable. Clarice said nothing. Bellamy placed the envelope on the counter with a dramatic thud and, with mock generosity, walked over to a small welcome table near the children's area where a bowl of complimentary mints and colorful lollipops was placed. He picked out a bright red one, returned to Clarice, and held it out toward her, saying it was a reward for persistence, like a treat given to a pet who keeps returning to the same locked door. Clarice looked at the lollipop, then at his hand, then simply placed her gloved hand on the counter next to the envelope and waited. Bellamy, now clearly feeding off the attention, called over junior associate, a young man barely out of college with a badge that read Investment Liaison Trainee, and announced with theatrical flair that they had a live demonstration today in financial cosplay, an unscheduled masterclass in how aspiration meets delusion. The associate looked confused at first, then laughed nervously as Bellamy explained that this was a lesson in appearances versus assets, and how not every suit and envelope signals capital. Clarice remained silent through it all. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just waited for the noise to pass. The associate's laughter faded quickly, his eyes darting back and forth between Clarice's face and the floor, unsure whether he had participated or simply witnessed. Bellamy, seeing no reaction from her, eventually stopped talking and returned to his office, tossing the envelope into an inbox tray without looking inside. Clarice waited a moment longer, her fingers lightly resting on the countertop, then turned and walked away. Her steps were even, her face calm, her spine straight. She did not rush. She did not pause at the receptionist desk. She walked past the elevators and down the hallway toward the main exit. But just before she reached the glass doors, she turned and entered a side corridor marked Administrative Offices and stepped into the elevator bay. The elevator doors were closed. She stood before them in silence, the hum of the building's machinery faint in the background. She reached up not to press a button, but to straighten the collar of her coat slowly, methodically, like a ritual, like a reminder. Then she glanced sideways at her own reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator door, not to check for flaws or smudges or stray hairs, but to look herself directly in the eyes. Her gaze was still sharp, still steady, not hardened, not angry, just resolute. There was no movement behind her, no sounds of apology, no footsteps of someone coming to say they were sorry. But she hadn't expected any. What she had expected, what she had counted on, was for the humiliation to keep escalating, and for Bellamy to become more predictable the more he tried to surprise her with cruelty. She had understood something that few people in the lobby could see yet, that the louder he became, the more desperate his act appeared. She was no longer shocked by the lollipop, no longer thrown by the comments, no longer pierced by the smirks. She was studying them now, cataloging every reaction, every complicit glance, every forced laugh. And while they believed they were reducing her, they were in fact building a record she would not forget. She stepped into the elevator when the doors finally opened, but she didn't press a floor. She just stood inside, alone, with the door open, letting the steel reflect her from all sides. Bellamy pretended nothing had changed. He still smirked when her name came up in hallway chatter, still made backhanded comments in team briefings, still referred to her as the repeat visitor who couldn't take a hint. But the laughter in the room wasn't quite as confident anymore. The junior associate who had once chuckled too loud now looked down at his notepad when Bellamy spoke. The receptionist, once quick to dismiss Clarice with a shallow smile and an empty screen, now paused a little longer before closing a calendar tab, her fingers slower on the keys. Somewhere deep in the building, someone had begun saving email threads. Another had started tracking timestamps. No one had said a word to Clarice, and yet the mood told a story of its own, the weight of discomfort slowly replacing the thrill of mockery. Clarice, meanwhile, had not missed a single detail. She noticed the way conversations stopped when she stepped into the lobby, the way someone always found a reason to walk away. But she also noticed the shifts, the receptionist who now made eye contact, the intern who held the door without making it awkward, the guard who nodded once when she passed. They were small things, almost forgettable, but to someone trained by experience to read between silences, they were clues. Indicators that the performance Bellamy had so confidently curated was beginning to falter under the pressure of its own repetition. Clarice knew that racists in suits often relied on rhythm, on predictable scripts, on audiences too passive to interrupt. But what they feared most was disruption. Not loud, explosive rebellion, but slow, quiet resistance that refused to follow the rhythm, that stood calmly when told to shrink, that returned again and again until the act began to collapse under scrutiny. She had not spoken back. She had not defended herself. She had simply remained. And that was enough to begin unraveling the performance from within. What none of them knew, what Bellamy especially could never have imagined, was that her presence was not a fluke. Her visits were not desperate bids for entry. They were intentional, documented, coordinated. With each visit, she had logged every detail, not only the words spoken to her, but the expressions, the timing, the body language, the people who stood by and said nothing. She had built a file thicker than any of the accounts they guarded so tightly, and it wasn't for revenge, it was for record. Because institutions like Halstead didn't crumble from one public scandal. They unraveled from patterns exposed under pressure. And she was applying that pressure patiently, like water against stone. After the fourth visit, she did not go home and cry. She went home and reviewed her notes. She adjusted timelines. She sent secure copies of her documentation to counsel. She updated the master file and highlighted a new column, public observability. She knew she was nearing the point where the internal would become external, where the private humiliation they had carefully confined to their white-tiled kingdom would no longer be theirs to contain. She had not yet decided when to tip the scale, but the weight was growing, and the building was already leaning. Bellamy, unaware of the storm quietly forming above him, doubled down on performance. The following day, he added a new item to his arsenal of sarcasm. A doormat printed with the phrase "No free consulting," placed just outside his office, as if the message needed reinforcement. He laughed as he positioned it, nudged it with his foot, adjusted it until it sat perfectly aligned with the hallway tiles. To him, it was just another layer in the joke, another way to say you don't belong without using those exact words. He didn't know someone upstairs had already flagged his behavior for tone review. He didn't know an internal memo had already been drafted with his name on it. Bellamy had turned her persistence into office folklore, referring to her behind closed doors as their mascot, their morning surprise, their walk-in reminder that not everyone who dresses the part belongs in the room. He joked with his staff about having recurring characters in the bank, like sitcoms did on TV, told them to brace for their motivational visitor, a woman with admirable tenacity, but no assets, no credentials, and no clue. And the worst part wasn't that they laughed, it was that they laughed differently now. No longer out of surprise or discomfort, but with the callous comfort of people who had normalized what should have been shameful. One day before she arrived, Bellamy placed a doormat just outside his office with a sarcastic slogan printed in cursive across the middle that read "No free consulting." And when the junior associate passed it on his way to deliver quarterly reports, Bellamy tapped it with his foot and winked. Everyone knew who it was for. So when Clarice walked in that morning, she already knew she was walking into a script they had written for her. She wore navy this time, understated and clean, her coat double-breasted and her shoes free of even a speck of dust. Her clutch was replaced with a slim black folder. She walked to the desk without pausing and gave her name, not because she expected anything to change, but because consistency was its own form of protest. The receptionist, now practiced in the art of passive dismissal, asked her to wait without looking up. And so Clarice did, taking a seat in the same waiting area where people whispered and glanced and turned their eyes away the moment hers met theirs. 40 minutes passed. In that time, Bellamy walked through the lobby 3 separate times. Once on the phone, pretending to be immersed in numbers. Once with a group of clients, gesturing to artwork on the wall like a curator. And once alone, flipping through a clipboard, pretending not to notice her seated just a few feet away. Each time he made no acknowledgement, though the corner of his mouth tugged upward slightly, betraying the satisfaction of dominance. At minute 42, he finally walked toward her, holding the clipboard close to his chest as if it were shielding him from confrontation. He stopped in front of her chair, smiled with tight condescension, and said in a voice loud enough for nearby ears that he appreciated determination in small doses, but you might be better off applying for cashier positions. They were always hiring downtown. He made a point to mention charity quotas again, saying sometimes persistence could open doors in the philanthropic sector, especially for those with stories to tell and lessons to teach. A woman in a fur coat, sitting just 10 feet away and cradling a designer handbag, scoffed at the remark, shaking her head slightly, the diamonds on her earlobes catching the light. Clarice looked up slowly, directly into Bellamy's face, but didn't say a word. She rose, adjusted the fold of her coat at the shoulders, and walked toward the doors without even glancing at the woman in the fur coat or the receptionist or the junior associate pretending not to overhear from behind the kiosk. She didn't press her lips together. She didn't clench her fists. She walked like the room was too small for her silence to fit inside anymore. As she pushed through the revolving doors, the doormat under Bellamy's office, a gift to himself, a stage prop to signal mockery, shifted slightly under the wind of her passing. Outside, the city hadn't changed, but something inside Clarice had begun to sharpen. She no longer expected the game to end. She no longer believed that the bank would suddenly remember its humanity. She had stopped waiting for Bellamy to get bored, or for the receptionist to grow a spine, or for the staff to develop a conscience. She wasn't there to be rescued. She was there to witness, to collect, to let every ounce of this manufactured cruelty stack against them like bricks they were laying themselves, unaware she was building something much larger than a record of mistreatment. She walked along the sidewalk as a tour bus passed behind her, the voice of a guide inside narrating something about old Chicago and its architectural marvels. Clarice didn't turn around. She passed a vendor selling roasted nuts on the corner, his cart steaming against the morning chill, and she nodded to him. He nodded back, not because he knew her, but because respect requires no introduction. She kept walking until the building behind her faded into the background, not because it had lost power, but because it no longer held the surprise of injustice. It had become predictable, and that predictability was its weakness. She walked with the same poise she always carried, but now there was a softness to her stride, as if she had reached a place beyond resistance, beyond the struggle for acknowledgement, and had entered the realm of quiet fortitude. She wore a light blue dress, tailored perfectly to her frame, its color muted and dignified. A single pearl pin rested just below her collarbone, gleaming with subtle defiance. Her hair was neatly pulled back, her shoes polished, her posture unbreakable. She stepped through the revolving doors, and this time, Bellamy did not wait to be called. He appeared almost immediately from the corridor, as if he'd been watching the door from his office, expecting her, perhaps even hoping for one last opportunity to perform. His arms were crossed as he met her at the threshold of the lobby, a smirk already formed, the disdain on his face less theatrical now, more personal. He didn't greet her. He didn't offer a pretense of professionalism. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and said, without hesitation, that she must be back to file another fantasy request, perhaps hoping that the sixth time was the charm. He asked whether she'd be proposing another community fund misrepresentation, or if this time she'd be pretending to inquire about wealth management while planning to gather office supplies on her way out. Clarice said nothing at first. She let the silence stretch between them like wire. Then she responded calmly that she had business to discuss. Bellamy scoffed audibly, turned his back without a word, and began walking. Clarice followed. They crossed the lobby in full view of clients and employees, his shoes clacking against the marble, her steps quiet but deliberate. People watched but said nothing. The receptionist barely looked up. Bellamy turned left at the end of the hallway, then opened a door tucked behind the corner of the building's architectural showcase. It led not to one of the plush client suites with large windows and espresso machines, but to a small glass room near the employee restrooms. The room had no carpeting, no artwork, no natural light. A mismatched set of chairs surrounded a table that bore faint coffee rings and the residue of old adhesive from torn posters. He motioned for her to sit without speaking and closed the glass door behind her. She sat. The room was quiet, not insulated but isolated, and through the glass she could still see the occasional passing employee, none of whom looked in. The chair wobbled slightly when she adjusted her position. She placed her hands gently in her lap, crossed the wrist, and stared ahead at nothing. No one came. She waited for 10 minutes, then 20, then 40. Still, no one came. An hour passed. No water was offered. No one checked in. The door remained closed. The air was dry and stale. She shifted once, uncrossed her legs, then recrossed them. She smoothed the hem of her dress. She touched the edge of her pearl pin. She remained composed. At exactly 63 minutes, she stood, not in frustration or anger, but with the same poise she had entered with. She reached for the door handle, opened it quietly, and walked down the hallway past the receptionist desk. No one met her eyes. No one called after her. No one stopped her to apologize or explain. She walked toward the front entrance, and as she passed the janitor, an older man with graying hair and a bent back pushing a mop, he glanced up from his bucket and tipped his hat gently in her direction. She returned a small nod, just enough to say she saw him, just enough to acknowledge the silent kindness he offered without asking for recognition. The doors opened again, letting in the cool air from outside, and she stepped through them into the street. The sounds of the city swallowed her quickly. Horns, footsteps, a voice from across the intersection calling for someone to wait. Clarice didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She kept walking, not to flee, not to forget, but because what she came to witness had already played out exactly as expected. She had been given the smallest room in the building, the worst chair they could find, the longest silence they could impose. And yet, none of it touched her. Because by this point, the humiliation had become so structured, so meticulously crafted, that it had turned into a blueprint of its own undoing. Each insult, each refusal, each orchestrated moment of degradation was not chipping away at her, but instead constructing a mirror too precise to deny. She walked 5 blocks before she paused. There was a sculpture garden nearby, tucked between 2 office buildings, almost hidden. She stepped into its quiet, let the noise of the city fade behind her. She sat on a stone bench in front of a small fountain, crossed her legs, rested her hands in her lap, and took a breath. Around her, birds flitted between trees. Clarice Whitmore did not return to Halstead Private Trust on the 7th day. Her heels did not echo through the lobby. Her voice did not drift across the marble floor. Her pearl pin, her press coats, her envelopes and folders and printed confirmations, all of them remained absent from the lobby that had for so long rehearsed its cruelty against her. The receptionist looked up at the door several times that morning, not because she expected her to return, but because part of her, buried beneath the rituals of complicity, wondered if she already had, and no one had noticed. Bellamy passed through the front twice before noon, whistling to himself with the ease of a man convinced that dominance, once performed enough times, becomes permanent. But sometime after 10, a courier entered through the main doors carrying a flat black envelope embossed in silver with the words "Private," for executive office only. He did not hand it to the receptionist. He walked past her straight to the elevator and asked to be taken to the 30th floor. The receptionist hesitated, then buzzed him up. The envelope arrived in the hands of Halstead's chief legal counsel by 10:15. The senior compliance officer received a copy 3 minutes later. Within 5 more minutes, an internal call tree activated, not the kind that responds to break-ins or network failure, but the kind triggered by imminent financial crisis. The letter inside the envelope was short. It was addressed not to Bellamy, nor to the receptionist, nor to any single branch staff. It was addressed to the Halstead National Office of Fiduciary Compliance and bore the letterhead of the Whitmore Heritage Trust, a financial entity with 10 listed subsidiaries, each of them publicly recognized in national tax records and philanthropic registries. The letter cited a full review of discriminatory engagement at the South Loop Halstead branch and a confirmed pattern of racially motivated obstruction toward one of the trust's authorized representatives. The body of the letter gave notification that all assets managed under the Whitmore Trust umbrella, totaling $2.7 billion, would begin immediate withdrawal processes within 72 hours unless remedial action and public acknowledgement were initiated. The bottom of the letter contained a single signature: Clarice T. Whitmore, Executive Trustee. Until that moment, Arthur Bellamy had never asked her last name. He had never thought to. She was, to him, the mascot, the prop, the punchline, the motivational visitor. But now her name sat in ink beside an amount of capital that exceeded the holdings of a dozen long-standing clients combined. The letter began circulating through internal compliance, risk management, and executive communications within minutes. Staff across regional offices began forwarding copies to one another with subject lines like urgent or immediate action required. Within half an hour, a legal assistant on the 30th floor began reviewing surveillance logs from the last 2 weeks. Within an hour, a human resources analyst had already opened a case file titled Clarice Whitmore Incident Review. And by 11:30, the receptionist, who had once printed a calendar just to pretend it didn't include Clarice's name, was now staring at a blank monitor, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Staff members who had once laughed or looked away began whispering in corners, revisiting what they'd heard and what they hadn't said. One associate walked past the junior investment trainee and muttered, "I think we all saw it coming," though he hadn't said a word during any of her visits. Bellamy remained unaware until after lunch. He received a call while walking back from a deli, and the tone of the regional director on the other end drained the color from his face before he even understood the details. He was told to report to the executive floor immediately, bring all interaction logs, and prepare to explain himself. His response was curt at first, claiming ignorance, insisting no wrongdoing. Then they said the number again, 2.7 billion. Bellamy arrived on the executive floor with his usual confidence, but it faltered when the compliance director handed him a printout of a letter with Clarice's signature at the bottom. He stared at it for several seconds, blinked twice, then asked if it was real. The director did not answer. Instead, they passed him a second document, a timeline of Clarice's visits, complete with internal notes, security footage timestamps, and recorded statements from both staff and witnesses. The file was thicker than he expected. Someone had been documenting long before the courier arrived. Someone had been watching. A silence settled in the room that Bellamy could not dominate with swagger or smirks. The words that had once come so easily to him, about appearances and charity quotas and financial cosplay, suddenly felt cheap and absurd in the face of legal memos and compliance thresholds and media risk assessments. Bellamy asked what would happen next. The response came bluntly: that would depend on what else she had. Downstairs, in the same lobby where Clarice had once been escorted to the restroom hallway meeting room, staff began moving more stiffly. The junior associate who had once laughed nervously now avoided eye contact. The receptionist tried to remember whether she had ever said Clarice's name out loud or only ever typed it into the calendar system with reluctance. An assistant in the accounts division retrieved her emails and reread every message Clarice had sent. None of them contained anger. None of them threatened. Each one had been short, professional, and exact. One line repeated across them all, confirming attendance per our scheduled time. Somewhere in the building, a senior executive whispered to another that it was already too late, that the board would want public action before the press got wind of the letter. The janitor who had tipped his hat to her stood in the hallway cleaning the elevator panels and didn't say a word. But when he looked at his own reflection in the steel, a faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. He had seen something they hadn't. Clarice was never small. She had simply been misjudged by people too proud to look properly. The building had spent 6 days reducing her to silence, and on the 7th, her name alone did more than any raised voice ever could. She never raised it. She didn't need to. Her letter had arrived without noise. But the silence it replaced was deafening. The silence in Halstead's executive wing was uncharacteristically thick the morning after the letter arrived. Not the silence of productivity or quiet focus, but the strained hush of a place bracing for consequence. Conversations took place in offices with doors tightly shut. Hallway chatter had all but evaporated. and the receptionists on each floor spoke only in clipped tones, eyes darting to every incoming email, as if the next message might contain their own reckoning. Bellamy had spent the night crafting a version of the truth that sounded like structure, a story built on the scaffolding of policies and procedures, one that painted himself not as the architect of discrimination, but as a dutiful executor of client standards. But his plans began to unravel before he'd even finished his first cup of coffee. At 8:12 a.m., a town car bearing no visible logo pulled up to a private entrance beneath the Halstead Tower, escorted by two members of the firm's internal relations team. Inside the car sat a folder, a handwritten note addressed to Ms. Clarice T. Whitmore, and a bouquet of long-stemmed lilies wrapped in navy paper. The letter contained an apology, not the templated one, not the HR-crafted version, but a direct, unambiguous acknowledgement of the behavior she had endured and a request for her presence to discuss restitution, reconciliation, and resolution. Clarice never stepped into the car. She had been expecting it, not the vehicle itself, but the gesture, the predictable scramble to reclaim face after the damage had already calcified. She did not need a car or an escort or a letter of apology to validate her experience. She had already validated it with her presence, 6 times over, with every silent stare and folded document and exit made without complaint. Instead, she instructed her counsel to arrange a private meeting, not at the branch, not in any Halstead office, but at a neutral location where lawyers could sit across from one another without the illusion of hierarchy or deference. By 9:30, that meeting was underway. Clarice arrived unaccompanied, walked into the conference room with nothing but a leather folio, and stated in clear terms that the withdrawal would proceed. There would be no delay, no negotiation. Her trust and all of its 10 subsidiaries would sever all affiliations with Halstead within 72 hours. She did not raise her voice. She did not express resentment. She spoke like someone documenting, whether unemotional but precise, and when she finished, she handed over a document already signed, time-stamped, and notarized. The lawyers from Halstead's side accepted it without rebuttal. They knew what it meant. She did not stay for coffee. She did not linger for pleasantries. She exited the room with the same poise she had carried through every insult, and this time, no one held the door for her, not out of rudeness, but because she had already passed through it before they realized what was happening. By 10:15, word had reached Halstead's board. The chair of risk compliance canceled a mid-morning investor call to assemble an emergency quorum. Minutes later, notifications began pinging through the internal client database. Account closure requests from 10 major investors, each of whom had ties to social equity foundations or diversity initiatives. Some cited press rumors. Others cited internal leaks. All of them cited discomfort with ongoing reputational risk. The total projected loss reached 9 figures before noon. In the branch office, where Clarice had once been told she resembled a janitor more than a client, the mood was suffocating. Bellamy sat in a third-floor conference room flanked by an HR representative and the regional director, who had flown in on the earliest available flight. He was asked to walk through each interaction, to provide justifications for why no one intervened, why complaints had gone unfiled, why security footage now documented 6 instances of client harassment with no disciplinary follow-up. Bellamy stammered. He spoke of tone, of misunderstanding, of corporate thresholds. He said the word protocol 17 times in an attempt to suggest that cruelty had been procedural, that mocking someone's posture or handbag was somehow aligned with financial policy. The HR rep said nothing for the first half hour. She simply took notes. The director grew increasingly red, not because of embarrassment, but because the numbers were now eating their way through quarterly forecasts. Bellamy tried to pivot, blaming poor training, lack of diversity exposure, even the receptionist for not escalating client conflict. But when asked whether he knew Clarice's last name prior to the letter, he paused too long, and that silence answered everything. Meanwhile, downstairs, staff whispered behind closed doors. The junior associate who had once laughed nervously during Bellamy's performance now sat at his desk, rereading his training manual on workplace conduct. The receptionist refreshed her inbox repeatedly, unsure whether she was next. A compliance officer in another city sent a confidential memo suggesting the branch undergo an external audit. And somewhere in the building, an intern asked an uncomfortable question in a team huddle. If she had been white, would any of this have happened? No one answered. No one had to. The truth had already arrived, not with shouting or confrontation, but with the methodical logic of divestment. Clarice's choice not to return, not to walk back through the same doors that had tried to erase her, was not an act of withdrawal. It was the final step in a strategy built on restraint, one that used silence as a scalpel and exposure as justice. Her name, now, carried weight not only in financial circles, but in human ones. Her story had traveled through the walls of Halstead not as gossip, but as a warning. And when the sun passed its peak that day, when the board members turned off their mics and leaned back in their leather chairs to process the scale of what they had lost, it was not the money that stayed with them. It was the realization that all of it had been preventable, that she had given them 6 chances to do the right thing, that she had offered dignity even when none was returned, and that when she chose to speak, she did so not with a megaphone, but with a signature. A woman who had once been laughed at for her coat, her voice, her presence, had now rewritten the balance sheet. And those who had once treated her as a mascot now realized they had been actors in a performance of their own demise. The fallout did not arrive like a storm, but like a slow-burning fire igniting in a dozen places at once, unstoppable and fueled by years of dry silence that had made the perfect kindling for one spark to consume everything. Within 48 hours of Clarice Whitmore's final meeting, the story that began with unspoken humiliation inside a marble lobby reached public eyes through channels that no boardroom could contain. It began with whispers online, employees past and present referencing the branch's history of selective service, anonymous posts from insiders revealing a culture of elitist gatekeeping, and eventually a leaked copy of the letter Clarice had signed, complete with the list of trust subsidiaries and the full amount in divestment, all time-stamped and authenticated. The media took notice by the end of the week. First it was finance blogs and independent equity monitors, then regional news, and finally national outlets who picked up the scent of hypocrisy disguised as policy. But what escalated it beyond a financial loss into a social reckoning was the footage, blurred, silent clips, captured by internal surveillance of Clarice being waved off, ignored, spoken over, and once left alone in a forgotten glass room. The footage didn't need sound. The expressions on the faces were enough. Bellamy, still referred to formally in headlines as Clifford Hayes Arthur Bellamy III, became the unwilling face of what happened when entitlement collided with power in public view. His name, shortened across social media to just Hayes, began trending, attached to hashtags that accused him of racial gatekeeping, institutional arrogance, and the polished cruelty of exclusion. Protesters began assembling outside the bank's main branch in downtown Chicago. At first, it was a few dozen with signs bearing Clarice's name and phrases like "Dignity denied is justice delayed." But by the following day, the crowd had grown into the hundreds, and nearby businesses began boarding their windows, not in fear of violence, but in anticipation of what they now understood was inevitable. The CEO of Halstead issued a formal apology by the 3rd day, standing at a podium flanked by executives who looked like they had just stepped out of a deposition. He read from a teleprompter, using carefully written phrases like deep regret, systemic blind spots, and renewed commitment to equity. But his tone lacked conviction, and his delivery lacked sincerity. Clarice was not named directly. Her initials were not mentioned. But everyone knew. The video of the press conference was clipped, remixed, and reposted with overlays of the surveillance footage and images of Clarice in her light blue dress, head high, hands folded, walking out of the building one final time. And then the email surfaced. A cache of correspondence from Hayes' inbox, leaked by a whistleblower with access to the branch server, revealed years of internal messages filled with racial innuendo, jokes about client zip codes, mockery of accents and clothing, and even direct references to Clarice under nicknames so thinly veiled they collapsed under their own cowardice. Screenshots were shared across every platform, tagged and dissected by journalists and activists alike. No one was surprised by what the emails contained, but everyone was enraged by how comfortable he had been sharing them. He hadn't hidden his bias. He had dressed it in humor and hierarchy and sent it from a company domain. Within 12 hours of the leak, Halstead's legal team announced that Hayes had been terminated. He was escorted from the building under the glare of camera flashes, wearing a coat that no longer fit and sunglasses that did not hide his shame. A security guard carried a box behind him, filled not with personal belongings, but with documents that no longer meant anything. His pension was revoked pending litigation. His access to internal systems was shut down. And his name, once spoken with respect in boardrooms and golf courses, was now etched into the public consciousness as a symbol of professional prejudice. Halstead's stock dropped nearly 14% by week's end. Clients withdrew not only capital but trust. Corporate partners announced internal reviews of their Halstead holdings. 2 major universities ended investment agreements with the bank. A class action suit loomed, organized by civil rights groups who saw in Clarice's story a blueprint for a broader confrontation with financial discrimination. Bellamy, now alone in his apartment, sat in the dark as his phone buzzed endlessly with messages he no longer answered. The once proud man who had dismissed a black woman in a beige suit as irrelevant now saw his face on screens across the country, paired with captions that turned his legacy into a cautionary tale. Outside his apartment, someone had spray-painted the sidewalk with a phrase in red block letters: "Years of hate behind tie." Beneath it, someone else had written, "We see you now." He peered through the blinds and saw 3 people standing across the street, not shouting, not holding signs, just standing and watching. He let the blinds fall shut and walked to the center of the room. The walls felt smaller. The silence, which once protected him, now pressed against his ribs. He poured himself a drink and sat on the edge of his sofa, but even that ritual felt meaningless. The apartment, once filled with certificates and glass awards, had already begun to feel like a museum of denial. He turned on the television. Every station told a version of the same story. Each variation began with a woman walking into a bank and ended with a man being forced out of one. Hayes turned off the screen. The darkness was quieter, but not peaceful. For the first time, he understood that silence, too, could be judgment. And this silence didn't fade. Months passed, and the story that had once dominated headlines with the fire of scandal slowly receded into the quiet churn of daily life, no longer front-page news, no longer a trending topic, but never truly gone. What Clarice Whitmore had set in motion could not be undone by silence or time. It had already taken root in boardrooms, law schools, civil rights panels, and kitchen tables where conversations about dignity and power were now being held with names attached and histories acknowledged. Halstead Private Trust rebranded, issued internal reform packages, and replaced leadership across several departments. But the name Clarice never left the corridors entirely. It lingered, not as a shadow of controversy, but as a standard of what could happen when someone refused to vanish. And then, far from the marble floors and polished brass of Chicago's financial district, in a small room with folding chairs arranged in a circle, Clifford Hayes, Arthur Bellamy, 3 sat in silence. No name badge, no audience, no scripted speech. The room was part of a racial reconciliation workshop hosted by a nonprofit known for working with former offenders of institutional prejudice, CEOs, police captains, school board officials, those who once held power and misused it. Hayes was not invited to speak. He had not been asked to share his story. He came because after the cameras turned away, after the protests moved elsewhere, after the graffiti was cleaned and the inbox went quiet, he found that silence still followed him. But this time it did not protect him, it unsettled him. In that room, surrounded by people whose experiences mirrored the damage he had done, he sat not to defend, but to absorb. The stories poured out around him, of exclusion, of humiliation, of careers derailed and families embarrassed. And Hayes did not flinch, because there was no more flinching left. He simply listened. Across the city, in a grand conference hall filled with warm lights and rows of chairs lined in gold fabric, Clarice took the stage at the National Summit on Systemic Equity and Financial Accountability. She wore a dark suit with understated earrings and spoke without slides or props. Her voice was calm, her cadence measured, and she addressed the crowd not with outrage, but with clarity. She spoke of systems that were built not to serve, but to sort, institutions that dressed exclusion in the language of professionalism, and people who mistook power for immunity. She did not mention names. She did not need to. Her message was never about revenge. It was about responsibility. She spoke of a woman who walked into a building 6 times and was never seen, and a system that finally looked up only after money turned its head. She paused, letting the silence settle before stating that real change does not come when institutions panic. It comes when individuals choose discomfort over denial. Her words landed without applause at first, not because they lacked impact, but because they demanded reflection. Then came the standing ovation, not explosive, not theatrical, but rising like a tide, steady and full. She stepped down from the stage, shook hands, and moved on to the next conversation. There were no fireworks, no headlines screaming her name, but her presence carried a weight now recognized beyond titles and balance sheets. A week later, in a modest apartment filled with books he had not opened and furniture he no longer polished, Hayes sat at a small table with a stack of blank cards. His handwriting, once reserved for memos and directives, now traced slower, less certain lines across heavy paper. He wrote not to erase, but to acknowledge. He addressed letters to the receptionist he had intimidated, the junior associate he had used as a prop, the janitor he had overlooked, and even to Clarice herself, not to ask for anything, but to state plainly what he had done and what he had failed to do. Each letter was folded and sealed without ceremony. He did not post them all. Some stayed in the drawer, not out of cowardice, but because he understood that apology was a gesture, not a remedy. In the months that followed, donations began arriving anonymously to community banks, serving underserved neighborhoods across the city. No press releases accompanied them. No names were attached. Only the signature, a former executive. Hayes never returned to finance. He found work cataloging historical documents for a local archive, a job that required more listening than speaking, more care than charisma. He never spoke publicly again. Clarice, on the other hand, kept speaking, not about herself, but about the people like her who were still walking into rooms where they weren't seen. She spoke at schools, conferences, banking summits, correctional facilities, and community centers. She shared a single message, reshaped each time for the room it entered, that silence in the face of cruelty is not neutrality, it is consent. She reminded people that dignity is not a loan institutions can approve or deny. It is a right earned by living, asserted by courage, and protected by truth. She stood not as a symbol, but as a continuation, a reminder that justice is not one moment of reckoning, but a series of daily choices made by people who decide to look, to speak, and to stand. Her name, once ignored, now appeared beside legislation efforts, equity training programs, and financial literacy grants. Her influence lived not in headlines, but in new policies, reshaped hiring practices, and shifted attitudes. She did not claim credit. She did not seek recognition, but she had planted something that could no longer be uprooted. And in that way, the story ended not with a verdict, not with a final confrontation, but with a transformation of a man who had once worn arrogance like armor, of a system forced to see its own reflection, and of a woman who walked through it all with her dignity intact and her purpose unshaken. The end. If this story left something stirring inside you, if you felt Clarice's silence speak louder than 1,000 protests, if you watched each stage unfold with growing tension and couldn't look away, then take a moment now to support this work. Like the video if her quiet resistance meant something to you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories that peel back the polished layers of power and reveal the truth underneath. And we'd love to hear from you. Which part of this story impacted you the most? Was there a moment when the injustice felt personal? Were you expecting the ending? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how this story made you feel. Because sometimes stories don't just entertain, they remind us what justice looks like when it finally stands up.